There is a rock shelter in the mountains of Colombia. It sits about 3,000 meters above sea level, near a small town called Nemocon, in a place called Checua. In 1992, archaeologists came here and pulled human bones from the ground. Nothing unusual, just another excavation. The bones got labeled, packed into a storage box, and put on a shelf. For 30 years, nobody looked twice at them. Then, in 2025, a team of scientists from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and the University of Tübingen in Germany ran those same bones through a genome sequencer, one of the most advanced DNA machines in the world. And what came back on that screen stopped the entire room cold. The DNA they were looking at matched no one, not any living human on Earth, not any ancient population ever recorded in the Americas. Not a single person alive in Colombia today, not anywhere. Kim Louise Kretek, a researcher at the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and Paleoenvironment at the University of Tübingen, said this in the official study. In the area around Bogota, there was a complete exchange of the population. Complete exchange. That means one group of people disappeared completely and another group replaced them. No mixing, no children together, no shared ancestry. Nothing. Dr. Andrea Casas Vargas, a geneticist at the National University of Colombia and one of the lead authors of the study, told CNN, "We did not expect to find a lineage that had not been reported in other populations. It is an entirely new lineage." This was also the first time in history that full ancient genomes had ever been published from Colombia. The first time ever. Professor Cosimo Post from the University of Tübingen, the senior author of the study, confirmed it directly. These are the first ancient human genomes from Colombia that are published. Now think about that. Colombia is the gateway between North America and South America. Every human being who ever walked from one continent to the other passed through this land. And we had never once sequenced a single ancient genome from here until 2025. The people in that storage box had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right question. Now we know their name. Scientists call them the Checua, named after the site where their bones were found. They lived on this high, cold plateau for at least 6,000 years. These were not people passing through. They were home. They hunted animals in these highlands. They buried their dead with care. They had language. They had memory. They had their own names for the mountains around them. And then, about 2,000 years ago, they were gone, not conquered in a famous war, not remembered in any legend, not absorbed into another tribe, just gone. If you are the kind of person who refuses to let stories like this go unanswered, subscribe right now. Because what is coming in this video is only the beginning. And here is the question that this story keeps forcing back to the surface. How does an entire people, one who lived in the same place for 4,000 years, disappear without leaving a single trace in anyone alive today? Before we answer that, tell me something in the comments. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? And have you ever had a DNA ancestry test done? What did it reveal about where you really come from? Because your answer might connect to everything we are about to uncover. The last Checua genome disappears from the record about 2,200 years ago. And in that exact same window, almost to the century, something new begins appearing on the Bogota Altiplano. Pottery. Beautiful geometric pottery with patterns pressed into wet clay. Agriculture, new foods, and people carrying DNA that had been developing separately from the Checua for up to 10,000 years. Let that number sit for a second. 10,000 years of separate evolution. These were not distant cousins meeting at a crossroads. These were two completely different chapters of human history, suddenly occupying the same plateau. Scientists call this incoming group the Herrera culture. named after the archaeological period their pottery defined, around 2,800 years ago. But the actual genetic break is sharper, and later, about 2,200 years ago. That is when the Checua genome vanishes from the record and the new ancestry takes over. Their DNA traces back to Chibchen language-speaking populations from lower Central America, groups whose roots connect to the area around modern Panama and the Amazonian Andean border. These people did not arrive by accident. They moved south through mountain passes, brought their culture with them, and settled the same high plateau the Checua had called home for millennia. Now here is where this story makes its first major turn. A March 2026 preprint study, submitted by the same research teams from Universidad Nacional de Colombia and the University of Tübingen, found something that completely changes how we understand this replacement. The Herrera ceramic style, those painted pots, those geometric patterns, appears in the archaeological record before the genetic replacement is complete. Read that again. The Checua were already making Herrera-style pottery before Herrera ancestry people had fully replaced them. The culture outlived the people who first resisted it. They adopted the newcomers' craft. They learned from them. They traded with them. And then they disappeared anyway. Contact without mixing. Proximity without continuity. That is not how human populations normally behave. In all the research on ancient DNA populations across the world, a clean replacement like this, zero genetic contribution forward, is extremely rare. Most of the time, when two populations meet, they mix. They leave traces in each other. Even conquered peoples leave descendants. The Checua left nothing. And the people who replaced them, they built something that would make the entire world stop and stare. Lake Guatavita, 50 kilometers northeast of Bogotá. At dawn, the water is black and completely still, ringed by green Andean hills that seem to lean inward, as if they are protecting something. They are. The people who descended from that Central American migration wave, who had replaced the Checua on this plateau, eventually became the Muisca, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in pre-Columbian South America. And the Muisca had a ceremony. When a new king was crowned, they would cover his entire body in gold dust, fine gold, pressed into his skin until he was gleaming from head to foot. Then they would load him onto a ceremonial raft, thousands of people watching from the shore. Gold objects thrown into the water as offerings. The Golden King paddling toward the center of the Black Lake, an offering to the god beneath the water. The Spanish heard rumors of this ceremony from 1,000 miles away. They called it El Dorado, the Golden One. They spent 200 years and thousands of lives searching for it. But here is something the search for gold completely missed. The Muisca, who performed this ceremony, carried DNA in their cells that had been separated from the Checua for up to 10,000 years. Dr. Wolfgang Hack, group leader of population genetics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, has described this level of genetic separation as equivalent to populations that split apart before the last ice age. These were not neighbors who gradually displaced each other. They were strangers from entirely different chapters of human prehistory, sharing the same lake, the same mountains, never knowing what the ground beneath them once held. And now this. The second major twist in this story. The Muisca had extraordinary oral traditions, rich, detailed stories about gods, about creation, about the sacred geography of these highlands. They had stories about this lake. They had stories about gold and water and the beginning of the world. They had absolutely no stories about the Checua. Not one legend, not one myth. Not one oral memory of the people who occupied this same land for 4,000 years before them. The Checua were not defeated enemies, remembered as warriors in war stories. They were not honored ancestors. They were not a cautionary tale. They were simply not there. erased from cultural memory as completely as they were erased from the genome. Dr. Ana Maria Groot de Mahecha, a Colombian archaeologist and professor at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia in Bogotá, whose decades of Muisca research established the foundational timeline for the Altiplano, has written that the Muisca's sense of belonging was profoundly rooted in landscape rather than genealogy. The genome data now shows exactly why. Their genealogy did not lead back to these highlands. It led back to Central America. The land felt like home. The history beneath it was someone else's. When Spanish conquistadors drained Lake Guatavita in 1580 searching for gold, they found objects, but not the mythic hoard they imagined. What nobody thought to ask, what else is preserved in the cold, airless layers at the bottom of that lake? And more importantly, the genome study did not stop at the Muisca. It kept going, further north, to a related highland people called the Guane, and what it found there broke the model completely. Before we go there, quick question. Did you watch our last video? Sumerians, they built the world, then vanished? Tell me in the comments, the Sumerians disappearing or the Checua disappearing? Which one shocks you more? I want to know what you think. The model seemed clean. Checua replaced by Herrera. Herrera becoming Muisca. One wave, one replacement, and one story, done. Then the study looked at two individuals from a northern highland group, the Guane, dated to about 530 years before European contact, and the clean model shattered. While the Muisca showed near-complete Central American ancestry by the late pre-Hispanic period, the Guane showed a different genetic profile, a separate thread. Their admixture, the mixing of ancestries in their DNA, suggested either a different earlier migration event into the northern Andes or contact with populations moving along the Amazonian Andean corridor that the main Herrera wave did not use. The Guane were not a northern branch of the Muisca. Genetically, they were something else. Dr. Cristobal Neco, professor of anthropology at the Universidad del Cauca in Colombia, and one of the most widely cited voices on Colombian prehistory, Ney has long argued that the Andean highlands were far more demographically complex than the colonial-era sources that shaped our models ever admitted. Two individuals from one group, and they cracked the model open. Now here is the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. The Guane mummified their dead. They placed their mummified ancestors in cliff-face tombs, carved into the rock, visible for miles across the mesa landscape. Some of the best preserved mummies in the entire Americas. They have never been fully genomically sequenced. They are sitting in storage rooms at Colombian universities right now. If their full DNA follows what those two samples suggest, the Guane may represent a third independent lineage in Colombian prehistory. One that has no published name, one we have not yet properly studied, and it gets worse. Of the thousands of identified pre-Hispanic burial sites in Colombia, fewer than 30 individuals have ever had their genomes published. Fewer than 30. In a country that is literally the gateway between two continents. Professor Christina Warrener, a scientific archaeology professor at Harvard University, told CNN directly, "Until now, Colombia has been a blank spot in the ancient DNA of the Americas." A blank spot. In the gateway, two individuals from the Guane produced this much disruption to our understanding. What happens when hundreds more are sequenced? The answer to that question is buried in a storage room. Unread. Right now. The Guane mummies are not the only archive we have failed to open. September 2nd, 2018, a Sunday evening, or the National Museum of Brazil, the oldest and largest natural history museum in Latin America, catches fire. The building had no functioning sprinkler system. Emergency funding requests had been made for years. They were denied. 20 million artifacts burned in one night. skeletal remains, preserved tissues, recordings of languages that are now extinct, ceramic objects that connected living communities to their ancestors. The genomic potential of an entire continent gone in a single fire. And this is not an isolated event. Across Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, the majority of pre-Columbian skeletal remains have never been genomically sampled. Some collections have no funding, either others are in legal disputes, indigenous communities filing legal challenges to reclaim their ancestors' remains before scientists finish studying them. A conflict with no easy answer, while the DNA inside those bones degrades a little more every year in tropical storage conditions? Dr. Eski Willerslev, Prince Philip Professor of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and one of the pioneers of extracting DNA from ancient degraded samples, has stated publicly, "We are in a race against time. Every year we delay sequencing, we lose data permanently. Ancient DNA does not wait for funding cycles." He has specifically named South American collections as critically underprioritized in global genomics research. Now remember the Checua skull, the one that eventually yielded Colombia's first published ancient genome. It was excavated in 1992. It sat in a labeled storage box at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia for 30 years before anyone ran a genome sequencer over it. 30 years. The answer was already there, filed, shelved, waiting. The question just was not being asked, and here is what that means. The Checua genome survived not because of funding or planning or scientific urgency. It survived because the rock shelter at Checua sits at 3,000 meters altitude. Cold, dry, naturally preserved. Accident of geography. The DNA held together because of where they happened to die. Most of Colombia's ancient sites are at lower elevations. Warmer, wetter. DNA degrades within centuries in those conditions. The window to recover this information is narrowing every single year. And yet, in March 2026, a new preprint study was submitted. Same institutions, same researchers, and it suggests something about the Checua replacement that changes the story in a way nobody expected. Before we get to that 2026 study, step back for a second, because the Checua are not alone. In November 2025, a separate research team published a genomic study of 238 ancient individuals from the southern cone of South America, Argentina, Patagonia, the Pampas region. They found another previously unknown genetic lineage, one that first appears 8,500 years ago and becomes the dominant ancestry of the entire southern half of South America for at least 8,000 years. Genetically isolated, culturally diverse, and then, like the Checua, gone. Two ghost lineages, two different ends of the same continent, both invisible to science until the last 12 months. Professor Cosimo Post from the University of Tübingen, the same researcher who co-led the Checua study, has described the pattern found in the southern cone as one of the most unexpected findings in American population genomics, cultural divergence without genetic mixing on a continental scale. What this means is that people across South America were developing completely different languages and cultures. While their DNA stayed almost identical within their own isolated groups, they evolved culturally without mixing biologically. That is not the textbook model. The textbook says populations spread, mix, blend. South America was doing something different. And then, buried inside the DNA of a 1,500-year-old individual from Uruguay, our researchers found something that has no accepted explanation. A genetic signal related to Denisovans. Denisovans were an ancient human species. We have found their remains in caves in Siberia and Southeast Asia. We know that some populations in Papua New Guinea and the Philippines carry a small percentage of Denisovan DNA. Evidence of ancient interbreeding, tens of thousands of years ago. There is no agreed migration route that puts Denisovan ancestry in Uruguay, but the signal is in the data. Dr. David Reich, professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School in the United States, and one of the most important figures in ancient DNA research in the world, has written that signals of archaic human ancestry in the Americas represent one of the field's most urgent unresolved questions. He has specifically stated that certain genetic signals found in Amazonian populations demand a migration event for which we currently have no archaeological evidence. No evidence, but the DNA is there. And if the Americas were reached by populations we have not yet mapped, populations that arrived by routes we have not yet found, then the story of the Checua fits into something much larger than one vanished group on a Colombian plateau. It fits into a story of a continent that was populated in ways we are only beginning to understand, and there is one skull found in a cave in Brazil that has been forcing this exact question for 50 years. A cave called Lapa Vermelha in central Brazil. Archaeologists are digging through 17 meters of sediment. That is roughly the height of a 5-story building, packed into the earth above her. When they reached the bottom, they found a skull. Tests dated it to between 11,000 and 14,000 years old. They reconstructed her face from the bone. They named her Lucia, and her face did not look like the faces of populations from Northeast Asia, the region where the accepted model says the first Americans came from. Her facial structure matched more closely to populations from sub-Saharan Africa and Australasia. Dr. Walter Neves, a professor of biological anthropology at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, the scientist who first formally described Lucia's morphological distinctiveness, has spent decades making one argument. The evidence for multiple migration routes is in the bones. It has always been in the bones. We simply did not want to accept a more complicated story. Lucia's DNA has never been fully recovered. The tropical environment degraded it almost completely. But partial genomic analysis of other Brazilian individuals from the same time period shows traces of ancestry related to Australasian populations. Dr. Pontus Skoglund, group leader at the Francis Crick Institute in London, UK, published research in the journal Nature confirming that an Australasian genetic signal is detectable in several Amazonian groups alive today. His exact words: "A population related to present-day Australasians contributed ancestry to some Native Americans, implying a more complex peopling history than previously accepted." More complex. That is the scientific way of saying we do not fully understand how the Americas were populated. Now here is something about Lucia that goes beyond the science. On September 2nd, 2018, the same night the National Museum of Brazil burned and 20 million artifacts were destroyed, Lucia was inside that building. 20 million things turned to ash. Lucia was found in the rubble the next morning, intact. She had survived 14,000 years in a cave and a museum fire in the same story. And her full genome has still never been published. Someone buried Lucia 14,000 years ago. Someone mourned her. Someone arranged her body in the earth and left her to the dark. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they believed happened after death. We know only that she mattered to people whose names we will never recover. And she has been in the ground, and then in a museum, and now in storage. And she is still trying to tell us something we have not yet been able to hear. If Lucia's people were here 14,000 years ago, before the standard migration model fully accounts for them, they had to arrive a different way. For decades, the accepted story was clean. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska. They moved south through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers. They spread across the Americas. One entrance, one direction, one story. The Checua genome does not fit that model cleanly. Your Lucia's morphology does not fit it cleanly. The Denisovan signal in Uruguay does not fit it. The southern cone ghost lineage does not fit it. What does fit, much more cleanly, is a different model: the coastal kelp highway hypothesis. The idea is this: the first Americans did not walk through an ice corridor. They followed the Pacific coastline by boat, or on foot, along ice-free coastal edges, moving from Alaska southward, leapfrogging from one hospitable stretch of shore to the next, fast, fragmented, isolated into pockets very early. That model predicts exactly what the Checua genome shows: rapid diversification, small isolated populations, genetic profiles that diverge from each other very early in South American prehistory. In May 2025, a landmark genomic study of 1,500 individuals from 139 indigenous groups across northern Eurasia and the Americas was published. More data than any previous study of this kind. It was expected to settle the debate. It did not. It made the picture sharper and more complicated. The more data accumulates, the more roots seem to have existed. And now the 2026 preprint, the one submitted by Universidad Nacional de Colombia and the University of Tübingen, the one currently under peer review. It found that on the Bogotá Altiplano, the ceramic and agricultural transition, the Herrera culture spreading, happened before the genetic replacement was complete. The Checua were already living alongside Herrera ancestry people, already learning from them, already adopting their pottery. Dr. Johannes Neubert, an archaeologist and co-investigator on the 2026 preprint at the University of Tübingen, wrote in the study's discussion that this pattern raises the possibility of a prolonged contact phase during which cultural transmission occurred without significant genetic exchange, an outcome that is difficult to explain under standard demographic models. Difficult to explain. Not impossible. Just without an answer yet. The Checua adopted the culture. They did not disappear overnight. There was a period of contact, maybe decades, maybe a century, where two completely different peoples shared this plateau. And then the Checua were gone. Not killed in a sudden war. Not swept away by a single plague. Just gradually, completely, finally, gone. No descendants. No memory. No name in any story told afterward. Two studies from the same institutions, young 12 months apart, pulling in slightly different directions on the how and the when. The science is not converging on a neat answer. It is getting more precise about exactly what it does not yet know. And the people who live on this plateau today, the living communities of the Colombian highlands, they are asking their own version of this question. There are people living on the Bogotá Altiplano today, indigenous Colombian communities whose ancestry the 2025 genome study traces directly back to that Central American migration wave. The descendants of the Herrera, the heirs of the Muisca. They have oral traditions, stories about their ancestors, stories about El Dorado and Lake Guatavita, stories about the sacred geography of these highlands, the mountains, the rivers, the meaning of the water. They have no stories about the Checua, not because the Checua were forgotten, because there was no one left to do the forgetting. The 2025 Science Advances paper states it in one sentence. The Checua do not carry differential affinity to ancient North American groups, nor contribute genetically to ancient or present-day South American populations. Every human being currently alive in South America, every indigenous nation, every family, every uncontacted group deep in the Amazon, carries exactly 0% of Checua DNA. 0. They are the most complete documented human disappearance in the genetic record of the Western Hemisphere. Dr. Andrea Casas Vargas, the geneticist at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia who co-authored the study, told reporters after publication, "What surprised me most was not just the genetic isolation of the Checua, but the completeness of their disappearance. In all my years of genomic work, I had never seen a population vanish so thoroughly from a region they had occupied for so long. They were real people. They had everything. And then they had nothing. She also said this: "We are not certain what occurred at that time that led to their disappearance, whether it was environmental changes or if they were supplanted by other groups. They do not know. Science does not know." Now here is the final thing this story asks you to sit with. The name Checua, the name we use for these people. It is the name of the archaeological site where their bones were found, a word from a later language, given to a place by people who arrived after them. We do not know what the Checua called themselves. We do not know what they called this plateau. We do not know their word for the lake, or the wind that comes off the savanna before dawn, or the mountains they could see from the shelter where they slept. Their self-given name, like their DNA, left no survivors. What we call them is a label placed on a grave by strangers. The rock shelter at Checua is a protected archaeological site. You can visit it today. You can stand in the exact space where those people slept and hunted and buried their dead and watched the same stars the Muisca would later name. The soil is the same soil. The mountains are the same mountains. And if you dig down in the right spot, 6 feet into that earth, their bones are still there, still holding the genome that matches no one, still waiting, still entirely alone in their category of human being. Somewhere else on this plateau, in the northern ranges, along river valleys descending toward the Amazon, there are other bones that have never been touched by a sequencer. They may show us that the Checua were not unique in their uniqueness. They may show us that the Americas hold dozens of these erasures, dozens of complete disappearances, dozens of peoples who lived full human lives and left not a single living descendant to ask what happened to them. And if that is true, if the continent we thought we understood is actually layered with ghost lineages we have not yet found, then the question this story leaves open is not a scientific one. It is a human one. What happens to a people when they vanish so completely that even their grief disappears with them? If you want to keep asking that question, if you refuse to let these erasures go quietly, then stay with this series. The next episode goes somewhere even older and even stranger. And if you have not yet watched our episode on the Sumerians, the civilization that built the foundations of the written world and then disappeared, watch it after this one, because the pattern you just saw here in the Colombian highlands and the pattern in ancient Mesopotamia are separated by an ocean and 12,000 years, and they are terrifyingly similar